Hi everyone, it's Refresh, and I just went to the Magic Core Set 2019 pre-release. And this is what you get when you go to the pre-release. You get one of these pre-release packs. Still using the vertical shape pre-release pack deck box. You can take off the slip cover, and you get one of these deck boxes with a Planeswalker logo. Very simple. Inside you get 6 packs. You get one spin down life counter with the M19 logo on it. I've already opened the packs, obviously, to build the decks, and you also get a foil promo card, my promo card being the Goblin Trash Master, which is date stamped with pre-release weekend and then is shiny. In addition to the aforementioned things, you also get this little advertisement for different Magic the Gathering things, such as Magic the Gathering Arena and Friday Night Magic. And then on the back is a how to build a sealed deck. This is everything I opened. As you can see, it's pretty heavy in the red and green. I got 2 mythic rares, the Crucible Worlds and Arcades the Strategist, the Crucible Worlds being a pretty valuable card. So I managed to do well in terms of overall money. Other rares that I got include a Phylactery Lich, the aforementioned promo Goblin Trash Master, a Banefire, a Prodigious Growth, and a Patient Rebuilding. Those are all the rares that I got. I got a bunch of uncommons as well, but between all this, I first thought a red and green deck might be good just because of the number of creatures and spells, but it wasn't all that impressive. Then red and blue, perhaps going on the Gutter Snipe and Salvager of Secrets recycling instance plan, but that wasn't that impressive. White was particularly weak in terms of volume, even though it had a whole bunch of aggressive creatures. I thought I could play white-blue, putting in some of the artifacts to take advantage of a little bit of the artifact sub-theme that blue has, but in the end, I decided to play all the colors. So this is the deck that I built. I ended up going pretty greedy. I eventually thought that base green and blue was probably the best way to go, because I have some late game threats in Dreadmaw, Thornhide Wolves is decent, and then I have a lot of ways to slow down the game earlier with Giant Spider and Daggerback Basilisk. And Skyrider Patrol is probably one of the strongest uncommons that I have. And so that was my base, and then going red got me the Draconic Disciple, which would give me a bit access to ramp and fixing, and so I might as well just go ahead and splash it for Electrify and Banefire, as my removal / Banefire is also a potential game winner. From there I was like, well, I'm already in blue and I have fixing and Draconic Disciple, might as well play the Psychic Symbiont because that's a 3-for-1. And then I was like, oh well, I need more fixing, so let's go ahead and play the Dragon's Horde and the Manolith, as the Dragon's Horde is basically a Manolith as well. And then I was like, I'm playing the Dragon's Horde, I might as well play Arcades the Strategist because he's a good body for his rate, and I already have 3 different kinds of fixing. And from there I just played a few blue cards, a few green cards, and I played the Marauder's Axe to power up all of my creatures. The Meteor Golem was another 2-for-1, and the Draconic Disciple could get there in the end. And this is the deck that I made. All I have to do is survive the early game, and you know, if I'm playing against a super aggressive deck, I think I would probably switch my deck out even more to combat that early aggression, but otherwise I felt like I had something here that could work. What do you think? Was this too greedy? Did you see a better deck that I could have built? Let me know in the comments below. In the very first match, I played against a Naya deck, which is actually mostly a Gruul deck, splashing white. In the very first game of the very first match, I took a mulligan to 5, and I pretty much could only just barely try to recover. Not being able to get all my colors made it even harder, and I lost pretty easily from there. For the second game, I forgot to take a picture, but I did record the score. It was a pretty tight game at first, but eventually I managed to play a Skyrider Patrol, and with this thing I was throwing an increasingly larger Thornhide Wolves up into the air over and over again, and eventually managed to turn the tide with my opponent being forced to chump from standstill, as I kept making it bigger and fatter and got the win that way. The third game was much tighter, but eventually I managed to out-grind my opponent by playing bigger creatures, and then the Skyrider Patrol again did its job, making some of my creatures bigger, as well as the Colossal Dreadmaw with a Marauder's Axe, and eventually my opponent just ran out of ways of dealing damage to me, and so I finished him off, even despite taking a mulligan to 6. And so I came up with a 2-1 win in the first match. In the second match, I played against an Esper deck, which is really just a Dimir deck splashing white. The first game was a toughie, with myself taking quite a bit of damage at the front while my opponent gained a lot of life. But as soon as I managed to ramp out the big creatures, which my opponent would kill one after another, I turned the game around pretty well, and eventually got through for the win thanks to the big creatures and my opponent just not drawing creatures that matched up to those creatures. Although he did have a lot of removal for the creatures that I did play, so they kept dying, but I outdrew him in terms of good creatures. In the second game, it was quite close, but eventually my opponent kept drawing creatures. I didn't draw as many creatures, and my opponent removed all my good creatures, and so I lost. And in the third game, it was again a bit of a close fight, but I managed to play more threats than my opponent did, and the Skyrider Patrol again did its thing before my opponent eventually was able to kill it. And at the end, I managed to turn the game around just barely thanks to being able to play big creatures, turning my Draconic Disciple into a bigger creature for the win in a single swing before my opponent could get more removal or play bigger bombs. The third match was against a Bant deck that was primarily Silesia, but with a bit of blue splash. The first game went to me, and that's just because it was a pretty tight game at first, but my opponent flooded and I took advantage of it, and also managed to get my Skyrider Patrol powering up all of my creatures again. This time, even though my opponent put a Luminous Bonds on it, I was able to use its ability every combat, and so that was pretty cool. The second game, I started off pretty well, but my opponent kept removing my creatures, and then I started flooding out. I'd stabilized at one point, but then my opponent played Prodigious Growth on his 4-2, and from there was little I could do because I didn't have creatures big enough to deal with that aura, and I wasn't able to draw any last piece of removal I could to remove that creature, and so I died. But that was a really close one. The final game, was another close one again, up until my opponent managed to kill or lock out my Colossal Dreadmaws and my Skyrider Patrol, and then from there he managed to play big creatures while I just drew lands and didn't draw the removal I needed for the big creatures, especially his 3/7 flyer Windreader Sphinx, which gave him both card advantage and a threat in the air that I couldn't do anything about, and so I lost that, losing 1-2 and dropping out of contention for the big prize packs. My fourth match was up against a Mardu deck that was actually primarily Orzhov with a red splash for a removal spell. My opponent was a little salty at the loss, so he swept up his cards before I could take a picture. But in the very first game, my opponent got a ton of life, gaining a life return because of his Fountain of Renewal, and had hit me a few times before I was able to stabilize, and eventually I kept drawing threats while my opponent kept drawing lands, and the tide turned as my big threats ate his smaller creatures over time. But it was a really long grinding game. Like, he had played a ton of really big creatures and a ton of small creatures, including a 5/4 black flyer that recurred itself in the graveyard. But again, if all he's doing is drawing lands and I'm drawing big threats, I'm the one that's going to get through, especially with the Skyrider Patrol having pumped some of my creatures in the past, like the Thornhide Wolves. For the second game, my opponent again suffered from a bit of flooding while I played the Skyrider Patrol and got in on the attack. It was actually pretty brutal because I was able to land giant spiders, grow the giant spiders, attack with the giant spiders and the Skyrider Patrol, and then also land a Colossal Dreadmaw, which promptly got removed. But then I Banefired my opponent for 7 damage, and then promptly brought it back with the Salvager of Secrets, and then Banefired again for the win. before my opponent was able to find anything to stabilize. And he was also mana screwed because he had removal on his hand for all my creatures, but he didn't have his second black mana and was unable to do anything about my assault. And so that was a 2-0 win, and that took me to 3-1. For my efforts, I got 2 packs of Core 19, which, you know, what is a pretty small reward, but it was also a pretty low turnout for this morning's event, and so that was that. Overall, I felt I kind of surprisingly enjoyed playing this set just because of its slowness in terms of the amount of time that you have. The format is a bit slower, I mean, especially in Sealed, and so you have time to be able to play big creatures and play a lot of colors. And the packs have this interesting thing where you can find a dual land in the land slot, even though of all my lands I got only 1 dual land and then 5 regular lands, 1 of each color surprisingly. And that helps you splash, and I guess because the Elder Dragons in the set are 3 colors, it's probably a good thing that they do show up in common. But that and the Manoliths at common, as well as the Dragon's Horde, really helped me as well in terms of ramp. And so I thought that the set played pretty well. The pre-release itself was, again, no frills. It wasn't especially interesting because there wasn't much added to it that made it special. It was just, you know, open packs, build your pre-release pool, and go play some Magic. Fortunately, the games were fun enough to make up for the fact that the pre-release itself was rather ho-hum, and that was my Core 19 pre-release. Let me know what you thought about the decks, the games, what you thought about your own pre-release if you went to one, and if you have any questions about anything that I showed you or talked about. Otherwise, this is Refresh. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.